Hello, welcome back to my channel if you're new here. My name is Mary and today's video is going to be my wrap up for the months of September and October. Since I have not done a wrap up in so long, I'm not going through my stats today and I'm just gonna rapid fire through these books. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that I read in September was actually Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, and then the second epilogue to that book, both by Julia Quinn. I was really excited for this because my favorite season of the show is Colin's season, and I was really looking forward to reading his book. His is the fourth book in the series, so the show goes a little out of order, but it's totally fine. I'm still planning on doing a full Bridgerton breakdown video. I didn't love Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. It was fine. I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was totally okay. But for whatever reason, like the pining that you see in the show, I think because you get to watch them through the other love stories pine after each other. This is about Penelope, who is one of the Featherington sisters. She lives across the street from the Bridgertons. And then Colin Bridgerton, who is the third Bridgerton child. They go in alphabetical order, so it's really easy to remember which one is which. He is a world traveler trying to find himself type thing, and then in the show they really focus on this friends to lovers thing, and they also really focus on Colin's youth, I guess, and immaturity in some ways and naivete in others throughout the seasons. But I felt like that was kind of missing from the books. In the books, he's very much a rake, just like his other brothers, which is not similar to the show. I mean, they sort of throw that into his season, but I just was expecting more soft, gentle feelings than I actually got from this. I don't fully remember the epilogue. The second epilogue is years in the future, just getting more with the characters. And I don't remember exactly what happens, but I did like the epilogue, I think, more than I liked the actual book. I think I gave it 4 stars. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fine. Oh no, I gave it 3 stars. I was wrong. Again, I thought it was fine. Clearly it's not memorable to me, but I'm sure if I really thought about it, I could figure out what the epilogue was about. The next thing that I read in September was The End of Policing by Alex S. Vitale. I don't know how his name is pronounced. This is a nonfiction book about police, primarily in the United States. It goes through the history of how the police was started. It goes through ways that he feels the police are not effective at doing what they purport to do, which is protect societies and communities that they underserve and things of that nature. My biggest qualm with this book, I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It was an interesting read. First of all, I knew most of the stuff in this book before reading it, and I was really looking forward to, I guess, a glimpse of the future if we do defund the police or things like that. I was looking for his solution to the problem rather than just saying, these are all the problems. And I feel like he really didn't offer many solutions, if any. So that was sort of why I gave that one 3 stars. It was, again, it was fine. It was informative, but I already knew the information, so it wasn't really useful for me to read. The next book that I read in September was I Am the Ghost in Your House by Mara Ramasco Moore. This is a YA paranormal of sorts. It's very light fantasy, set in our world, but it follows this girl who is invisible, essentially. She and her mom are both invisible people, they can't be seen. And so in that way, they are very much like ghosts. And in this book, her mom has had this problem where she started turning invisible even to the main character. And so when her mom disappears, the main character decides to go back to this house that she haunted of sorts when she was a child, because she developed a kind of romantic interest in a girl that lived there. If she wears clothes, she can be seen, but it's just, she has to wear undershirts because anything that touches her also turns invisible. So it's kind of complicated to explain, but she ends up going to this Halloween party where she wears this really long undershirt thing so that when she wears her costume on top of it, she can still be seen. She meets this group of people and develops these friendships, and it's just sort of about that. I thought this book was really, really interesting, and I actually really enjoyed the story of it. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was a very good read, but it is kind of a convoluted storyline. And it also deals with her relationship with her mother, her relationship with herself, and her relationship with her dad, and how she interacts with the world, which I thought was just a really interesting, and I've never read anything quite like it. Then I read Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano, which is again, one of those multi-generational family stories, kind of, except for this one really focuses on one family, one generation of a family. It's similar to The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, but I preferred The Dutch House to Hello Beautiful. And the reason for that primarily is I just connected with that story more. So this one follows William, I believe is the guy, and his sister died when he was a baby, and so his parents were never emotionally available to him because they were constantly grieving throughout his childhood, so he was very much on his own. And then he goes to college and he meets this woman and they sort of fall in love, and she has 2 sisters. I think it's 3 sisters total. and it's about his integration with their family, and then also like different things that happen over the course of their lives that sort of tear this family apart, which sounds really dramatic, and it really isn't quite that dramatic. Like, it's not a loud breaking of a family, but it's just like small things that happen over time with each of these sisters. So it really focuses on the sisters' relationships with each other, their relationship with their parents, their relationship to William. And he's almost like an outsider. He's almost like, what is the name of the guy in The Great Gatsby who's narrating it? Like, that's kind of what his vibe is, where he's sort of telling this story, and he's very much a central focus point of the story, but he's also like very much observing everything that's happening around him. And I thought this was really good. It was really emotional. It was very like, it ticks a lot of boxes for me, but something about it didn't quite like give me all of the feels, which is why I did not get 5 stars. Then I finished The Talented Mr. Ripley, also in September. I gave this one 4 stars. This is the first in a series, which I did not know going into it, but it is about this guy, Tom Ripley, who is a con artist, and he gets approached by the parents of a like young man who has sort of fucked off to Europe. And the parents are like, Tom, we want our son to come back home. He's got to take over the family business. They've got all this money. So they're like, we'll give you this money, this nest egg, if you can go to Europe and get our son back. And so it's a lot about Tom trying to do that, but then things go awry. I feel like everyone probably knows what happens in the story, but if you don't, I don't want to spoil it for you. I will say this book is so slow leading up to what I knew would happen eventually. And once it happened, it picked up and was more like bingeable, but for whatever reason, I had a really hard time connecting with the characters in this one. The gist of it is that I've read other books that are similar to this premise, and I read a book that one of the reviews even calls it The Talented Mr. Ripoff, but I liked that book better because for whatever reason, I connected to the characters more. I was more invested. That's a more modern take on it too. But this one was not bad. It just, I'm sounding like it's a negative review. It's a positive review. I gave it 4 stars, but the point of what I'm trying to say is that I didn't really connect with the characters in the way that I would have liked to, and that put a damper on my enjoyment. Then I read Dead to the World by Charlene Harris, which is one of the books in the Suki Stackhouse series. I don't remember what number I'm on with those, to be honest with you, but this one is a paranormal romance series about Suki Stackhouse, who is a barmaid who is telepathic in Louisiana. And in this world, vampires are real, and they have come out of the woodwork and said, hey, we're real, and there's this synthetic blood that they can drink. So the books start with her developing a relationship with this guy named Bill, and then getting really wrapped up in the paranormal world. And as the world goes on, there are shapeshifters and other things happening. And so these books, they're all fine. I gave this one 3 stars. It was fine. I have a good time reading them. They're very like cozy fantasy almost. They almost remind me of cozy mysteries because they are such like, there are overarching plots throughout all of them with the characters, but each book is very episodic, if that makes sense. Once again, not a bad book at all. I have a good time every time I read these, but they're just not something that are like, it's not like a favorite series of mine. Then I read Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey, which is a romance. And this is about a woman who is the youngest sibling in her family. Her family has this like family company. It's like a construction company or like remodeling or something. And she is a professional clown. She's never been taken seriously. And so she decides that she wants to be taken seriously. And then the male love interest is a former professional baseball player whose career has sort of fizzled out. Like, I think he was injured and that's why he doesn't play anymore. But he has this opportunity to become a sportscaster. But to do that, they want to see that he is responsible and like gonna stay in one place, if that makes sense. Like, he has to give up his fuckboy ways and become this like upstanding member of society of sorts. They fake date. And what I thought was really interesting about this book is they fake date, but it's like they're both immediately open with the fact that they have an attraction to each other. And he is really good friends with her older brother. And so her older brother doesn't want them to date. And it just, that like becomes part of the drama with it. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. I really would like to read the rest of this series. I think it's called the Hot and Hammered series. And I believe the other ones all follow siblings and then friends of the family. So I'm excited to continue in that one. Then I read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I gave this one 3 stars. It's super long. I'm very glad that I read it. Like, I feel very accomplished, but I don't know that I loved it. Like, I don't know that I cared that much about it. I didn't know going into this book. So I knew the premise because I've seen the Keira Knightley movie. Who hasn't? I don't know that I knew. I know I did not know. There are 2 like main characters. There's Anna Karenina, and then there's this guy Levin. And Levin, let's see if I can remember the convoluted way that they're connected. So Anna Karenina is married and has a sister-in-law named Dolly, I think is what it is. And Levin is one of Dolly's love interests. And the other one of Dolly's love interests is this guy Vronsky, and Vronsky and Anna Karenina end up having an affair. And that's what the book is basically about. Again, it's a tragedy. It's a Russian classic. It's long-winded. And Levin's chapters, he is like a farmer and really into like farmers' rights in rural Russia. And I didn't care about that, unfortunately. So his part of the story is the most part of the story. Like he has, I want to say, at least half, if not like 60% of the story is his perspective. And I just found that so boring. This book also suffered from the thing that happens for me a lot when I'm reading things, where I felt like as soon as something interesting was happening, they would do a time jump and then briefly recap all of what would have been very interesting to read to give you more boring stuff, in my opinion. Just my opinion. I know a lot of people like this. Apparently, this is widely considered the best novel of all time. I disagree, but it is what it is. I'm glad I read it. 3 stars. Then I read Burned by Patrick Ness, which is a standalone YA fantasy. And in this world, it's historical fantasy, so it's set in the 1950s in the US, but dragons are real. So that's like the premise. And this girl is mixed race, so there's still the racism that's happening in the United States. Her mom has died, so she's just living with her white father. She has this romantic connection to a guy who is of Japanese descent. In this world, dragons are real, and this girl and her dad live on a farm. They can't afford to hire farmhands, so they hire this dragon to like clear the land, basically. There's a little bit of a convoluted like religious cult undertone plot to this. I didn't dislike this book, but it just is very much not something that I would care to read. Like as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, this is fine, but it wasn't a book for me. And I know that I'm not the target demographic, but also like, I would think that I would like a dragon book, but I didn't. So I don't know what that says. You'll have to let me know if you've read Burned by Patrick Ness and how you felt about it. I've heard about this book for years. When it first came out, I want to say Becca from Becca and the Books read it, and it's been on my mind since then. I thought it was fine. Then I read Moon-Blooded Breeding Clinic by C.M. Nacosta, which is a nodding book. I read this as a social experiment for myself to see if I could handle nodding. It's a sequel to The Morning Glory Milking Farm, which I have not read, but I've heard about. But this is a monster romance where it's a human girl and she ends up with a werewolf, is what he is. And there is a scene where they get down while he is in wolf form. So just be aware of that, I guess. But the premise is that werewolves have like really fertile sperm. And so she's a human girl. She wants to have a baby. She was with a lizard man for a while. He didn't want to have kids and they had like mismatched sex drives. So they have broken up or gotten divorced or whatever it was. And she decides to go to this clinic because she wants to have a baby. And she meets this werewolf who's going to impregnate her, and then they fall in love. And that's the story. 3 stars. It was fine. There you have it. Then I read The Quiet American by Graham Greene, which is another classic that I've been meaning to get to for a while. And this one is an anti-war book. It's anti-Vietnam War, and it's set in Vietnam. And we follow a British journalist. And there's like an American guy who, I had to look it up, but apparently he's like an agent of some kind. But at the beginning of the book, he is found dead. And so we're getting this British journalist's like take on what happened. There's like kind of a love triangle because this British journalist was wooing this young Vietnamese woman, and then she ended up developing a relationship with this American guy, and it's like all about that. I give this 3 stars as well. I thought it was fine. I would like to watch the movie because I feel like it might make more things make sense. Like I was having a hard time with this one, figuring out what was the past and what was the present timeline, which again is a reader comprehension problem. But I don't know. I liked this book, but I also like have no real thoughts about it. So those are my non-thoughts about that. Then I read The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which I gave 3.5 stars. I was expecting to really love this book, and I just didn't, I guess. I had a really hard time with Ren as a character. So this book is a historical fantasy set in a land that is essentially China during the opium, or just after the Opium Wars, I think, is like what it's supposed to be, like the historical context for it. But this book follows Rin, who grows up really poor. She's a foster child in this home, and she decides that her only way out, basically, is either to get married, which she does not want to do, or to get into this really prestigious military institution. So that's what she does. So this first book, she is studying for this test. She gets into this institution, she's training, and she learns things about herself, and there's like magical powers to do with shamanism in this book. And so she's learning things about that. As the books go on, her character does become darker. And that happens really, I didn't think it would happen until like the second and third books. It happens in book 1, which I wasn't expecting. But I'm not going to tell you what happens, obviously. But she does, like, she's very morally gray. I will say my biggest qualm with her, and I don't know if this is like an internalized misogyny thing, she gets so frustrated that she cries a lot. And there's like a lot of her feeling like all of these big emotions. And I felt like, I have no problem with the character feeling big emotions, but I felt like I didn't feel any of those emotions. So for me, I was like, I don't understand. Like, I get why you're upset, but like, I wish that the reader had been included in that emotional journey. However, I have seen reviews where other people say that they were very emotionally invested. I just was not. So that's why this one got 3.5 stars for me. I am continuing the series. I will, I believe, talk about book 2, unless I read it in November. I can't remember when I read that, but there you go. Then I read Mary, An Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy, which I thought was a retelling of Carrie. And it turns out it's very like Carrie inspired. What would have happened if Carrie was a middle-aged woman, basically? And this is about a woman who's going through menopause, and she's kind of having like a psychotic break as she goes through menopause. And she has to go back to take care of her ailing aunt, I think is who it is, in the desert in either New Mexico or Arizona. I think Arizona, but don't quote me on that. So she's going to take care of her aunt, and like she starts seeing these like really creepy visions, and there's also like a weird cult activity happening in her aunt's home, and she gets wrapped up in that. And that's as far as I will go. But this book was, I felt like really well done. Like it balanced out well humor and gore, which is something that I look for in horror. So like if you like Grady Hendrix type books, I think you would like this one. I will say Grady Hendrix humor tends to be a little more juvenile, whereas this one doesn't ever feel juvenile. And that's not a dig at Grady Hendrix, but it's just like sort of the difference in the vibe is what I'm trying to like explain. But I really love this book. I don't know, I really connected with the main character, Mary, and I just really felt like, I don't know, I all of the plot points really hit for me. It was just one of those that like just really worked for me. Then I read Dead as a Doornail, also by Charlene Harris. This one I gave 4 stars. It has the least romantic subplot throughout of all the books that I had been in this story so far, and I liked it the most. So I don't know what that means about me, but I did enjoy this one more than I enjoyed the other book. But again, 4 stars, very good, solid read. All of my thoughts earlier are the same. I'm not going to tell you the plot of this book because it is in the middle of a series, but I already discussed the basic premise. Then I read The Whisper Man by Alex North. I gave this one 3 stars. I don't think I'm going to read any more Alex North books. I read The Shadows by him, and I want to say I gave that one 4 stars, but realistically it's more of a 3. I remember the like final twist, but I don't really remember much else about it. They're very similar tonally. They're kind of bleak books tonally. They both follow like these main characters who are men who just like, they have some tragedy in their past, and they're like really trying to like work through things, but it's just like not something that I love the pacing of, not something that I love the elements of. They also both have like a police procedural undertone, which is something that I'm learning for myself I don't really like. Like I don't really care for detective books or police books. It's just not something that I enjoy. I did give it 3 stars. This one he has a little kid, and his kid is like making, I don't know, something's happening with the kid to where people think things are wrong. And then the Whisper Man is the serial killer that was in this area that's already in jail, who would like everyone who was affected by him. They said that he attacked children, and they said that the kids could hear him like whispering to him before it happened. So that's why he's called the Whisper Man. And this involves like a copycat killer basically. So that's that book. It was fine. Then I read We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. I also gave this 3 stars. This is a book about depression primarily. It's about this girl who went to college after suffering some tragedies, and she's supposed to be meeting up with her best friend from high school who she hasn't seen since then. She has some unresolved romantic feelings for this friend, and she also has like a really hard time, like whatever has happened in her past. I don't know if it's a spoiler to say, and I also can't really remember, but she feels responsible for it. And so she's like really suffering from depression, and this just follows like a few days in her life leading up to this friend's visit and throughout this friend's visit. And it's about her like feeling like she doesn't deserve things, I guess. 3 stars, it was fine. A lot of people love this book. I thought it was fine. Again, I'm not the target audience. It's a young adult book. Then I read The 100 Years of Lenny and Margot, which is another young adult book, and I gave this one 5 stars. I loved it. This is about 2 people who meet in a like hospital ward for chronic patients. So one of them is an older woman named Margot, And then Lenny is a young girl who has terminal cancer. And they find out one day that if you add their ages together, you get 100. And so they start this art project where they are telling each other stories and then drawing the stories. And you basically just get both of their like lives kind of out of order. I found this book really emotional, and I just really loved the storytelling of it. It really worked for me. And it's a thing that I like. I like long stories that tell someone's whole life. Like, I think that's just something that really works for me. And I also really liked their bond. I really liked the differences between the struggles that they both faced, but how they were able to relate to each other. It just, again, it really worked for me. I then read 100 Things We Lost to the Internet by Pamela Paul, which is a nonfiction book. And it's basically about like 100 things that now that we have the internet, we don't worry about anymore. One of them is like home telephones. Am I making sense? Like, you have to call on the home telephone. There's like other things that she talks about. She talks about like encyclopedias aren't really useful anymore because you can just Google things and stuff like that. I thought it was interesting. It's pretty funny, but ultimately, again, just not something that I love. 3 stars. Then I read A Slow Fire Burning by Paula Hawkins. And this one's kind of convoluted to explain, but you essentially have multiple POV characters. And one of the POVs is a girl who is kind of being suspected of the murder of this guy. And the other POV characters are all sort of related to that guy in some way. So they're like the next door neighbor to his aunt, I think, is one of the characters. And another character is like his next door neighbor. And they all are just like interacting, and you're trying to figure out what happened to this guy. You're trying to figure out whether the main character did it because you don't really know. You're trying to figure out if it was someone else. And then all of these secrets start getting revealed. So I give it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It was very well plotted. It just isn't like a book that I love. Do you know what I mean? So there you go. Then I read Definitely Dead by Charlene Harris, which is another book in the Suki Stackhouse series. Again, 3 stars. It was fine. Same thing of like, the world is definitely starting to expand now that we're adding all these different shifter communities. There are other people who are witches, which is being introduced. I don't know. I like these books. Fine. Then I read Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo, which I believe is the last book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I finally read it. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I really thought that it stuck the landing. This is one of those series that I don't know if I even want to revisit it, but like in my head I kind of do, because like, I don't know, I liked all of the books. The second book definitely had like a little bit of a slump in the middle, I thought. I liked the way it wrapped up. It felt very like well plotted again, and I am so glad that I read it. So the premise of the series rather, is that we follow this main character named Alina, who discovers that she has these abilities that make her a Grisha, and what's different about her and other Grishas is that other Grishas find out when they're children. Like, you usually go through these tests when you're a kid, and if you have these abilities, you get taken to this magic school to learn how to use them. She doesn't find out until she's like 16 to 18. I don't remember her age at the beginning of the book series. I don't know what she was supposed to be, but she finds out that she has this ability, and then she has to go to the school, and she also has an ability that no one else has. So there are people who can like move the wind. There are people who can, I don't know, like craft metal really well. I'm not doing a good job of explaining all of the abilities, but hers is that she can summon light. She's a sun summoner, and there's no one else who can do this. And the only other person who can do something kind of similar is there's one guy who can summon darkness, and he's called the Darkling, and he's the most powerful of the Grishas. And so he and her, there's like kind of a love triangle with her and him, and then this other guy named Mal, who was like a childhood friend of hers, who is a soldier. I was a little disappointed with the way the love triangle went, just because I feel like Leigh Bardugo could have really gone there, and she didn't. I'm not going to tell you what I mean by that, but if you've read it, I think you know what I'm talking about. But again, it is a spoiler because this is a 3-book series. But I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was like a pretty unique system. I've heard people talk about the like, it's very Russian inspired, but people who understand the Russian language have talked about how like a lot of the names are like swapped genders, or like they're just, it's not like, people say that it's not super well done. I don't speak Russian, so that didn't bother me. I just think it's funny to note. Also, apparently Grisha is like the name Greg in Russia. It's like a nickname for their version of Gregory. And I thought it was especially funny because I read Anna Karenina, and there's a little boy that they call Grisha in that. And I was like, hee hee hee. But anyways, 4 stars, really good. I really enjoyed it, and I would like to continue there are other books in the same world, the 6 of Crow books, and then there's King of Scars, which is about one of the characters in the original Shadow and Bone trilogy. I believe they share some characters, but they happen like chronologically later, so I am excited to read those. Then I read, and that was the last thing that I read in September. So now we're moving to October. Sorry, this is not as rapid fire as I wanted it to be. First thing I read in October was Archer's Voice by Mia Sheridan, which is a romance about a woman whose dad recently was murdered, and so she goes to this town where she used to vacation with him, and she gets a job as a waitress there, and she ends up meeting this guy named Archer who doesn't speak because he had some like really traumatic things happen when he was a child, and so he doesn't have a voice box anymore. And it's about them falling in love and learning to trust each other. I give this 3 stars. I thought it was fine. I expected to be more like emotionally charged from it, but it really wasn't. And I think that's okay. It didn't fully work for me, but it was still good. Like I would, if it sounds like something you might like it. Then I read The 90s by Chuck Klosterman, which is similar to 100 Things We Lost to the Internet in certain respects. Like he talks about some of the same topic, like the home telephone, which I find hilarious because when I was growing up, we had a home phone until I was in college. Like my parents had that thing forever. And I think they only got rid of it because they moved and didn't bring it with them. So anyways, this book is kind of like a pop culture history of the 90s from someone who was like a teenager and a young adult in the 90s. And it was interesting in that way. I gave it 3.5 stars. I rounded down on Goodreads, which I normally don't do, but I just didn't feel like this deserved 4 stars for me because I didn't like experience any real joy while reading it. But it was good. Like it was interesting, but it just isn't. Ultimately, there were certain things about it that rubbed me the wrong way. He talks about being Gen X and how Gen X is the best generation. And generation bashing is kind of like odd to me, just as a general concept, but it exists. Everyone seems to do it. So I don't know, take it or leave it. But I think if you're interested in like pop culture things that happened in the 90s, which in theory I am, because I've mentioned I was born in the 90s, but I was a baby, like a small child. I was 5 when they ended. I would like to know more about things that happened when I was very young. I feel like that's a blank spot in my cultural knowledge. So it was good to read for that, I guess. Then I read Michigan versus the Boys. And this book I do think needs to come with pretty heavy trigger warnings. It's about a girl who, her name's Michigan and she lives in Michigan, which I'm trying to get over. But her school cuts the female hockey team. And so she decides to go out for the boys team. She makes the boys team and then she suffers all this abuse from the boys. And it's really about her like it's about what happens to her and it all builds up to one thing. I will tell you, maybe spoiler, maybe not. I needed to know this. She does not get raped. Okay. So that's out there. I was worried that is what was going to happen. It does not, thankfully. I gave this 5 stars. I really, really valued the like insight and the way that all of the topics were handled. I liked how her family responded to things. It felt very realistic in a lot of the ways that it was talked about. I really enjoyed this book. This is one that I would potentially not even reread, but like that I would like to own just to like have another YA contemporary that I love. I read Secret Identity by Alex Segura. And this, how do I describe it? I listened to the audiobook, which I think was a great way to go because it's based on like superhero comics, kind of. So the premise is this woman wants to be a comic writer and like illustrator. And she comes up with this comic idea, but no one will hear it until this guy who works at the same company as her comes to her and is like, hey, I need to pitch an idea. Do you want to go in together and we can pitch something together? And so she gives him, they work together on this idea, but it's mostly her ideas that he's just sort of like messing with, I guess. And then it gets published, but her name isn't anywhere on the publication. And then he ends up dead. And so she's trying to figure out like what happened. And several of the like chapter breaks include sections from the comic book. So I assume if you read it physically, it would have like the comic panels. But since I listened to it as an audiobook, it had like a narrator with like sound effects. And I thought that was really cool. I am not a comic person and I'm really not a superhero person. So I was happy to find out that it's not actually superheroes. It's just like, that's what she does for work. She writes comics and a lot of them are superhero comics. That being said, it's not something that like ultimately really worked for me. I did give it 3.5 stars. There's also this like mystery element with a woman from her past coming back up and how that's going. And I thought that was really interesting. That was my favorite part of it probably. But again, I like the drama. So it was good. 3.5 stars. It is part of a series. I don't know if I would continue in the series, but potentially maybe, we'll see. And I read A Fever in the Heartland by Timothy Egan, which I gave 4 stars. This is a nonfiction history book about the KKK in the 20s in Indiana. And it goes through like how the KKK sort of started, like gives you a little brief background, and then how it sort of fizzles out because it was made illegal for a while, and then how it comes back and the ways that it comes back and the ways that it like affected society, and also why this author is like, he's hypothesizing why maybe it came back at this time and in these areas, because where it was really prominent in the 20s was like Colorado, Indiana, and Oregon, I think, which I find very interesting. But also my hypothesis on that is those are places that are primarily white people living in them. Maybe not anymore, but at least in the 20s, because the South has a greater population of Black people and always has, because Black people were brought here to work on plantations or to be enslaved and like forced labor on plantations. And so I think maybe having a higher percentage of a Black population would mean that you would have a lower percentage of your overall population being a part of the KKK. That is just my premise that I'm working off of. I could be wrong. I haven't done any research on it. That's just like my common sense, what my common sense is telling me. But I think it was something like, I don't even remember the percentage, but it's like 25% of people in, maybe even more than that, in Indiana in the 20s were part of the KKK. But it mostly talks about this one guy, and he ends up getting brought down by this woman. And I will say there is like brutal stuff happening in this book. So obviously the usual suspects that you would expect from a KKK book, but a lot of like violence against women, violence against children, and like descriptions of like assault and rape and like horrible things. So if you can't handle that, I would not recommend this book. I did fine with it. It's a lot of court transcripts also from this like particular case of what caused the KKK's growth to sort of plummet after this thing happened. I can't remember the girl's, her name's Madge something, but she's like, the subtitle is something about like how one woman halted the KKK's growth or something like that. So it was good. I really enjoyed that book. I thought it was it was a topic that I didn't know a lot about, and it was very well written and very informative, and the way that it flowed meant that it didn't just read like a history book. Then I read Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera, which I read as an audiobook, and this is a mystery thriller with a podcast element. So I really do recommend the audiobook if you get a chance to listen to it. That's how I think it would probably be best listened to. But this is about a woman whose name is Lucy, and she, when she was in her early 20s, had a best friend named Savvy. They just graduated college. She was married. Savvy was not married. And they were like best friends. And then one day Savvy ends up brutally murdered, and everyone sort of thinks it's Lucy. No one can prove it. There's no proof. So Lucy gets to leave, but she can't stay in her small Texas town anymore. So she moves to LA, and then we're 5 years in the future, and she gets invited back for her grandmother's birthday party. And there's also a podcaster in her hometown doing a podcast about this murder of her friend to try to figure out what happened. And she decides she's going to help him figure out what happened, because she's like, I either need to know that it was me, because she has no memory of that night, or we need to figure out who did this. And so that's what the book is about. And I really loved it. I thought it was great. It again balances like humor and serious topics. And I like a podcast element. I don't know what it is about them. I think when they're really well done, they're really well done. And this one, in my opinion, was really well done. Then I read a fan fiction called A World Not Fit to Live In by Alyssa Dream and Snowblind12. I found out since this that they don't actually like it when you tag them on Goodreads, or when you like mark that you read their fan fiction on Goodreads, because they don't make any money from this and they don't really want your critique. So I did rate this. I gave it 4 stars. I will not be doing that in the future because they don't like it. So just so you know, in case you read fan fiction, I like to log it for like my own personal benefit. So I might just log it and not rate it, but I'm going to have to look back and see how people feel about it. But anyways, this book is pretty long, but it's Harry Potter fan fiction between Hermione and Lucius Malfoy. And basically the premise is Hermione gets like enslaved to the Malfoys with like this magical bond, and Draco is horrible to her, and Lucius and her fall in love. And that's what I'm going to tell you. Look into it if you're interested. I read this because it was listed as one of the darkest romances that Jen from the book Refuge had ever read. I don't know if I thought it was like, it's very dark, but I'm like, is my threshold for dark different than other people? Like the things that were happening in it, never mind. I was going to say they didn't bother me, but then I was thinking about all the things that did bother me. But like, I didn't find it hard to read, if that makes sense. But it is very dark. So, I mean, look at trigger warnings and look at reviews and stuff. There you go. Then I read The Turn of the Key. I reread it. So one of my favorite books. It's behind me. That's a Turn of the Screw retelling by Ruth Ware. Came out a couple years ago. It's Basically, this nanny goes to Scotland and has to be like a live-in nanny for these kids. All this weird shit starts happening and she's trying to figure out if it's ghosts, if someone's messing with her. The twist to this one is that it's a smart house. So the smart house is acting up. And I really enjoy it. I thought it was a great book. Then I read The Last Thing to Burn by Will Dean. I gave this one 1.5 stars. I don't like books like this. I kind of forced myself to read it because I hate myself, apparently. But I had just DNF'd something before this, which is why I didn't DNF this one. But it's about this woman who's being held captive in a basement, and she is in like rural England, I think, or rural Wales or something. And it's about how she tries to escape the basement and how she gets out. I don't like books like this. So for me, it was not something that I liked. If you liked things like that, like if you read House of Ashes by Stuart Neville and you liked that book, you might like this one. I hated that book too. So it's just not something that I enjoy reading. It's something that I'm learning about myself. I don't want to read about a woman being held captive. It's not for me. Then I read The King in Yellow by Richard M. Chambers. 2.5 stars. I didn't really like this book. I thought some of the short stories are fine. This is supposed to be one of the scariest things ever written. I didn't get it. But it's about this play called The King in Yellow where when people read it, things happen to them. It was fine. I do think that if the guy who did The Haunting of Bly Manor and The Fall of the House of Usher, Mark Flanagan, is that his name? If he were to do another miniseries around Halloween time, I think he should adapt this because I think he could do a really good job with it. That being said, I didn't care for it. Then I read The Plot by Jean Humph Corlitz, speaking of books that are right behind me. This is another mystery thriller. It's about this guy who is a teacher, and his student one day comes to him. He teaches at an MFA program. He wrote a book that did really well. None of his other books have sold, and so he's teaching and really hating his life. And the student comes to him one day and is like, I have this great plot. And the student's kind of an asshole. And then he finds out years later that the student died and never published a book with the plot. So he publishes a book with the plot, becomes this best-selling author, and then he starts getting these messages from someone being like, I know you're a thief. I will say, I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I had a great time with it. It does end up telling you what the plot is. It's not that unique of a plot. In fact, I've read 2 books this year with the same plot. So you can take that for what you will. It's also very on the nose with certain things. They use a character, or no, yeah, he uses a character from a popular book that has the same plot as the username for the person who is contacting him, which I thought was maybe that's clever, but also doesn't that just prove that the plot is not that unique? Everyone's talking about how unique this plot is. So anyways, that was my biggest gripe with this book. But if you just put that aside and have a good time, it's a good time. And the ultimate twist in this, the book within a book is the one that I think has a similar plot to other things. I'm not really a firm believer that there are no unique plots, but I think it's pretty hard to have a unique plot. But I really liked this book. I thought it was great. I had a great time with it, and that's my review. Then I read Wolf Song by TJ Klune, which is it's definitely not YA, but it's new adult maybe. It's a werewolf shifter romance. It's the start of a series called the Green Creek Saga, and you follow this family that's all werewolves. And then there's this boy who is not a werewolf, but he's in their pack. And when he's 16 and the youngest werewolf boy is 12, or 10, something like that, the youngest werewolf boy imprints on him. And they don't end up having a relationship until this kid is 17, and this guy's 23, which is still weird, by the way, but it manages to not be super creepy and predatory. I give this 3 stars. There's a lot of focus on other things that are happening in the world and this war within the werewolf universe, and I didn't care for it, but I did give it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. I have heard from, I think it's Peace Love Books, read all of these books, and she said that the first one is her least favorite, so I would consider maybe reading the other ones, but it's not high on my priority list. Once again, I've never read a TJ Klune that I cared that much about. So, hot take, perhaps, but I just think that his writing ultimately just isn't really for me. I liked the first half of that book much better than I liked the second half. I'll give you that. So then I read In Which Margot Halifax Earns Her Shocking Reputation by Alexandra Vasti. And this is a really short, really raunchy Regency era romance, and it's about this girl named Margot Halifax. I always forget her name. She enlists the help of her brother's friend or something, or her friend's brother, to escort her to go to Scotland to try to prevent her sister from marrying someone in Scotland. Her sister went there to elope, and she's like, I don't want her to do this, so let's go. And then she and this guy end up getting stuck on the side of the road in a cabin, and they do a bunch, and then everything happens from there. I thought it was fine. I gave it 4 stars, so I guess I liked it more than fine. It's nothing like super great, but I was fascinated that in 130 pages, I cared so much about this book, which I feel like is kind of hard to pull off. So congratulations to Alexandra Vasti. Good job. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really good. If you like Regency romance, that's a little out there, I think you might like this. Then I reread The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which is a short story from the short story collection, The Story of Your Life and Others. It's also what the movie Arrival is based on. This is a first contact with aliens short story, and we follow this doctor of linguistics who is contacted by the US government because these aliens have landed and we want to learn their language without teaching them English. And so she is trying to learn their language and like decipher it. And the reason they're doing that is because they want the aliens to explain to them how, like, their technology basically. And so the book is about that, but it's also like flashbacks, or like interlaced, I guess, with that storyline is the storyline of, her name's Dr. Banks, I think, storyline of Dr. Banks's life and her husband, her marriage falling apart, her daughter, like all of these things interwoven with the story. And I'm not gonna spoil the book or the movie for you, but they're both some of my favorite things. This is one of my all-time favorite short stories. It's one of my all-time favorite concepts. I love the movie Arrival. So that's my review of that. It is a reread for me. I read this originally last year or 2 years ago. I loved it. Can't say enough good things about it. I had a great time. Then I read When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. I'm so glad I finally read this. This is a mystery thriller with like horror-y elements, but I really do think it's like a mystery thriller set in Brooklyn, New York, and it's about gentrification. So the premise of the book is that there's this Black girl who lives there, who grew up in Brooklyn in this neighborhood, and she goes back home after her relationship falls apart. I think she was living in Washington State or something, moved back home to take care of her sick mom, and the neighborhood has changed. And it's changing constantly. And like all of these weird, eerie things are happening. And then the other perspective is this guy who lives across the street from her now, who is a white man, and he was in a relationship with a white woman, and their relationship is falling apart. But he befriends this Black woman because she wants to do like neighborhood tours that are more historically grounded in like the fact that this is a historically Black neighborhood. And so she's working with like the community to put that together. And he starts noticing through her eyes, because she's saying, this is weird. This store used to be this other thing. This bar used to be a jazz bar. Now it's like a weird brewery or whatever. So that's like what's happening there. And then you learn the more like sinister undertones. I thought this book was such a unique idea. I would really be interested to see it adapted to screen. I don't know if it ever will be, but I was very pleasantly surprised by this book because I had heard so many mixed reviews. I will say it's kind of slow to start. And my other big critique is there is a moment where a thing, I can't even explain it without spoiling anything, but there's a moment where a thing happens and you think something that you've thought the whole book is false, and then immediately it's no longer, like it's like solved so quickly. I would have really liked to sit in that for like a chapter, a few chapters, rather than like a couple paragraphs. That's my biggest critique. I had a really great time with this book. I thought it was like very well done. And like, I just really enjoy the like sinister undertones of something that like we've sort of accepted as normal. I really liked that. I thought this book was great. Then I read Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna McGuire, which is the second book in her Wayward Children series. The premise of this series is that kids go into their like portal fantasy worlds, and when they come back, they have a hard time adapting to society, so they go to the school with other kids who have experienced the same thing. This book is only the portal fantasy world of 2 of the kids, Jack and Jill, who are in the first book. So you get to see what happened to them before the start of the first book. I give this 3.5 stars. I think it's well written. They're all really short novellas. Like this one's less than 200 pages. That being said, like it didn't feel like a complete story to me. And I guess that's my biggest critique of it. I thought it was fine. And like, I don't know. I really struggled with how I was going to rate this because part of me really, really enjoyed the way that it was written. And then the other part of me was like left unsatisfied with the conclusion, if that makes sense. So that's my feelings on that one. But they have a really like dark, demented world where there's like vampires and like mad scientists, and it very much shows you why they're like that in the first book. But also I wanted more from it. Then I read Never Contended Things by Sarah Porter. I gave this 2.5 stars. It was not for me. I don't know that I really like fae stories, unfortunately. So this is a fae story, but it's about these 2 foster siblings who are in love. And I also didn't like either of the main characters. That was the other problem that I had with this book. I was not rooting for either of them. I thought they were annoying. I didn't think they had like a romantic taboo love story. Like it just, they were teenagers who annoyed me. No offense, teenagers. I just didn't relate to this at all. And the premise is that one day they're like drinking in the woods and they come across these fae people, and the foster brother gets taken, and then the foster sister has to go find him. And then the second half of the book has like a friend of the siblings who are not really related, I cannot stress that enough, who is like looking into this, and there's secrets galore and things are happening, but I just didn't think it was interesting. It just wasn't for me. So 2.5 stars. I'm glad I read it because it's been on my mind. Again, Becca in the books read it when it first came out. I think she didn't like it either, but you know, just one of those things where I just needed to read it eventually. And I read Just Last Night by Viri McFarlane. This one I gave 3.5 stars, which is disappointing because I gave the last book that I read by this author 5 stars. That was a fake dating book, which might be why I liked it more. This one is a second chance romance of sorts, but not even. Okay, let me think of how I can explain this to you. Part of why I didn't love this book is I was confused. For the first half, I didn't know who the love interest was supposed to be. And I really don't think this is much of a romance as it is like contemporary, like even chick lit-y. This book is about a woman who has this group of friends that she's been friends with since college. The guy, or since like high school in the US, but they call it college. I don't know. One of the guys in the friend group has been in a 10, 12 year, something like that, relationship with a woman. And at the beginning of the book, they get engaged, and then another friend dies very suddenly in a very tragic accident. And that other friend had a brother who ends up having to come back from the States to the United Kingdom for the funeral. And that is who the romance is with. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, I really enjoyed the second half of this book. I just had a really hard time getting into it. And I did not expect, because that might be a spoiler to say that she dies. I did not expect that someone would die. Like it says something happens and their lives are turned upside down. That's not what I was expecting. And so, sorry, for me, I would have liked to know more about the plot going into it. And I also would have liked the plot to get there faster. So those are my critiques of that book. Again, not a bad book at all. Just not something that I ultimately love. 3.5 stars is not a bad rating for me. It just means that it might be better suited to other readers. But I still enjoyed it. I had a fine time reading it. It was fine. Then I read He Started It by Samantha Downing, which is a sibling road trip book. Also gave this 3.5 stars, but this one was a very positive 3.5 stars because I had a really good time. The ending is what tanked it from being a 4-star book. But I couldn't even take it that much because I was like, I still had fun. It had a potential to be 5 stars. And then it dunked down to 3.5 because of the ending. I rounded up to 4 on Goodreads. I'm not gonna tell you what the ending is, obviously, but it's following these siblings who, when they were children, they went on this road trip with their grandfather. And now, in order to get their grandfather's inheritance, they have to go on the same road trip again. And as they're going on this road trip, you find out that it's actually the road trip from hell. And it's horrible. Ending, again, not out of left field, I don't think. I get what was happening, but it just doesn't logically make any sense. I understood the character's motivations. I understood the signs that were leading to that. However, if this were real life and that happened, the characters would not get what they wanted. I'm not going to go any further than that. That's that. Then I read Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park. I gave this 2.5 stars. This was a International Booker Prize longlist or shortlist. I can't remember. And it's set in Seoul, and we follow this guy who is a gay guy in Seoul, and it's about his many relationships. The book purports to be about him and his very close female friend. That's really only the first quarter of the book. And then she's not really a character anymore. And it just, basically it's split into 4 parts. Each part follows one of his relationships. I didn't love it. My favorite parts were the parts that were about his relationship with his mother. Again, that's something that I always like. So that's sort of how I felt about that. I didn't love the way that the story was told. I found it kind of confusing because at one point you jump forward 5 years and then you go back and tell that whole 5-year chunk of time. But I don't know. I just didn't really care for this one. It just didn't really hit me where I wanted it to. And I gave it 2.5 stars. Then I read The Hunted by Gabriel Bergmoser. I was really worried when I started this book that I was not going to like it. This is a horror book. I don't know if this is considered extreme horror. It might be. It's not that extreme for me. I didn't find it that extreme. It's set in Australia, which is one of my favorite settings. And it's about this group of people who live in Australia who have this game that they play where they hunt humans. That's the premise of what's happening. And you're mainly following these characters. There's this guy who lives at a gas station, who runs a gas station. a service station, he calls it. And his son and his son's wife are splitting up. And so he is watching his granddaughter for this duration of time. And so it's him and her, and then other people who are at the service station. And they find a woman who has been like, her leg is really hurt. So they're trying to do something to like help her with her leg. And then these people come, and it's like a game of cat and mouse. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was so fast paced. And also I like when it's not just torture. I like when there's like revenge. And that's kind of what this book was giving me. It was giving me revenge. I was rooting for all of the characters you're supposed to root for. I really like wanted this grandfather and his granddaughter to have this like great connection. Like they've been struggling with their relationship because they don't really get along super well, or they don't really know each other super well, but I was rooting for them. And that's what I like. I like rooting for characters. So this one is a really good book. I will say it's very disturbing, but in like an exciting way. I don't know if that makes sense. I had a great time reading it. That's it. That's the last book that I read in October. I didn't realize that. I'm going to quickly go through my DNFs for September and October. There shouldn't be a ton of them, but there are at least 2, I think. There's more than 2. There's 4, it seems. So I DNF'd Agent Running in the Field by John le Carre in September. I talked about this in the vlogs that I was doing that month. This is a secret agent book, and I don't really like secret agent books. I don't really like cop books. I don't like spy thrillers. That's what this is. I started it. I wasn't really getting along with the writing style anyways. It's about this older agent who is being asked back for one more job. But they do mention like real world current politics, and I don't like that. So I did not continue reading it. It just was not for me. Also DNF'd Welcome to Lagos by Chibundo Onuzo. Part of the reason I DNF'd this is I just like wasn't really vibing with the characters. I couldn't tell who was who, and there were like 8 or 9 POV characters in this contemporary story, and I just like, I'm not saying I would never return to this book, although I probably won't. It wasn't what I needed at that moment, and it was gonna put me in a slump, so I just DNF'd it. I said, this is not for me. I DNF'd Time as a Mother by Ocean Vuong. I'm not a poetry reader. I did read another Ocean Vuong book that I really, really loved, which is why I was curious to read this one. I didn't like it, so I didn't keep reading it. The cadence bothered me. It wasn't for me. I listened to the audiobook, which Ocean Vuong reads, which I thought would be a good way to do it. It didn't work for me. And then I DNF'd A Song of Wraiths and Ruins by Roseanne A. Brown, which is the first book in a African mythology-inspired YA fantasy series. And I didn't care about it, so I didn't continue reading it. I think I got like a third of the way through that one, and I realized like it's different than a lot of books that I've read because it is like a different mythology base, but it had the same plot structure. And I've read other books that do that plot structure that I was more engaged with. I hope that makes sense. That's how I felt about it. I didn't continue reading it. YA fantasy has been very hit or miss for me in general for the past couple of years, and especially like series. I don't really know if I want to start any more YA fantasy series. I say that having just read the Leigh Bardugo series, but like, do you know what I mean? Like, there are some things that I'm just like not really willing to give my time to, and that's one of them. So at just under an hour, we are finished with this video now. Thank you so much for watching it. If you did read any of the books that I talked about in this video, let me know how you felt about them in the comments down below. Also, let me know what you've read the past couple of months. I'm really trying to get back on track with my schedule. We'll see if that works. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If you would like to, you can subscribe to my channel. I do try to post 2 videos every week. We'll see how that goes, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!